Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm a lecturer in early childhood studies at Bath Spa University and an associate lecturer at the Open University. I'm a trustee for the Fatherhood Institute and also an independent writer and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be exploring representation in the early years, inspiring you with guidance on ways to be more inclusive in your practice. And I'm delighted to introduce Laura Henry-Allain MBE as today's guest. So Laura, as part of this discussion, I'm interested in exploring representation. What is representation and why is it so important to display this through the books and resources that educators use within their settings?
I think representation is very important for children to see that there are differences. And again, I think coming back to my point, especially for children who don't live in a diverse area, in terms of diversity, I'm thinking about race, I'm thinking about gender, I'm thinking about children who may not see two mums or two dads. And it's about breaking down those stereotypes from an early age. And I always like to quote, I don't know if any of the listeners are familiar with Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop and her research where she talks about mirrors, windows and sliding doors. So if we're talking with regards to books and literature, that the mirrors allow the children to see themselves, and the windows that they can look through and see the differences, and the sliding doors so that children can step into those worlds. And that's why it is important to have that levels of diversity for that empowerment and that self-identity for children to see themselves, irrespective if they've got a disability, gender, race issues, and for other children to have that awareness that there are differences within the global village that they live in.
Yeah, I think that positive representation is so important, as you say, in challenging those stereotypes that they might have learnt from particular media shows or whatever. Of course, you yourself has created and produced and written the script for Jojo and Gran Gran, which I believe started off as a children's book. And I was reading this morning that it's the first animation to centre on a Black British family in the UK. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about how that started and what it's led to since.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it just started, I think, from an idea, which most of books and TV shows come from, an idea that I had maybe from emptying the dishwasher or something like that. And so long story short, my heritage is St. Lucian in the Caribbean, where my parents were born. And my grandmother, who I was super close with, she died when she was 101 in St. Lucia. And I had gone back for 101st birthday. I was going back on a regular basis with my sons. And she was always recalling these stories when I was little, X, Y, and Z, the things that I did. And out of all of my 6 siblings, I would be the only one that was getting really excited on a Sunday when she used to visit. And in the Creole language, we call the grandmother Mama. So I'd be jumping up and down saying, Mama's coming, Mama's coming. And she remembered that, her short-term memory wasn't great, but her long-term memory was good. And tears were rolling down my eyes. And a few months after that, she passed away and I was grief-stricken. And I remembered these stories and thinking that I work in education. I think children would love these stories about a little girl and her grandmother. My middle name's Josephine, hence Jojo and Gran Gran. Got a few no's from the BBC initially because I was working on another TV show, and then eventually it got a yes, and it went live March 2000, a week before lockdown. And I don't know whether or not it was because of lockdown it became so popular because children couldn't see their families and, people were getting sentimental and X, Y, and Z. And we've had really positive comments globally, and coming back to that representation points for Black and brown families messaging me saying, they cried when they saw the episode. Equally, white parents are saying to me they love it for their children. And that's the positive representation, because Jojo and Gran Gran, when we're talking about representation, it is talking about similarities and it's talking about differences. So the similarities, they do everyday activities, but there are differences in there. For instance, when they, there's a cooking episode where they make callaloo soup. There's an episode when they go back to St. Lucia. All the listeners should go to St. Lucia because it's a beautiful place. And it's so important. And I'm really pleased the BBC have worked so hard on it. Everybody who's involved, the animation team was actually based in Bristol, A Productions. They've done a super job on it, and it's just so well received. The live action segments in it, the animation, the diversity, the nuances are really, really good. So I'm pleased about it. My grandmother would be super proud. And even when I go into settings and, you see the children, they're so proud and say they watch Jojo and Gran Gran. And I always add they are radio episodes as well, which a lot of listeners may not know about. So there is on BBC Sound, you can get Jojo and Gran Gran radio episodes. And I'm just delighted. And at the time, I didn't think it was the first Black British animation that's centered around, a Black British family. I didn't realize that, because obviously there were shows before that may have had a Black child or Black grown up, but wholly it was the first one. And let us hope that it's not the last. And I have got another show in development, which we're just waiting, fingers crossed, that will go into production.
Yeah, I have to say, when I read that statistic, I was kind of shocked that, that is the first show or animation to center on a Black British family. But, certainly long overdue, isn't it? And as you say, hopefully many more to come. I think, what's really special about that show is that it kind of normalizes differences that would otherwise be seen as exotic or kind of special or over there. It just makes it routine and kind of part of that child's life. And
exactly. And
that's really, really important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think to add there, the way that it's done in a very, holistic, gentle way. And I got an email, a message from a parent, a dad, and there's a one child in the animation, and he said, I am a same-sex parent family, and it was a delight to see one of the characters having two dads. And he was just saying to me, this is just amazing. I mean, in the live action and in the animation, we do show those differences in terms of disability, same sex, whether or not it's male or female, and it's done in a nice way. Do you see what I mean? And I just thought, isn't it wonderful that children can see themselves, they can see themselves on screen. And for that parent to message me, I just said, thank you for taking the time. And he just said, the joy of my child seeing that. And that, to me, that's when you're making a difference, or trying to make a difference, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like a show that you're really proud of, Laura. I can really hear that coming through. So that's representation for children. But I want to talk a bit now about representation for educators. You know that I'm a Black educator who's been speaking, delivering training for the past, several years or so. You yourself have decades of experience in this sector. We had Josh Cambridge Simmons on the podcast recently, and he was talking about his experiences as a Black educator. I know that you were involved in the earliest Blacklist a couple of years ago now. So I just really want to kind of hear your insights on the value of Black educators, having that community of thought and diversifying the kind of speaking and training sector for educators, and having that representation for Black and minoritized practitioners.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And and if I think way back when in the 80s, when I first started, very few, even at that early as educator level, the teacher level, but we are seeing that those changes coming through. And one of the things that I always have to reference here is that we may see in terms of educators and teachers that diversity in terms of race, but what we don't see is the senior leadership team level. What we don't see is the CEO of an academy trust. What we don't see are the senior lecturers. What we don't see is on a conference. So we have to ask ourselves, honestly, why is that? Why aren't the progression routes there for Black and brown individuals within the sector? What is actually, what is happening, and what can we do about it? What can we do about it? Coming back to that empowerment, as again, it's not for us as Black and brown individuals to speak out when we see it, when there's a conference and there's not a single Black or brown person speaking. And one of the things I always say, what message are we giving to the sector that Black and brown people don't have a voice, are not experts in their own right? You know, you're a doctor, Dr. Sharon Hollis, you've got Dr. Lewis, Stella Lewis. Yeah. We don't all talk about race and racism. There are other areas that we cover. You know, I talk about SEND because it's close to my heart because of my son. I talk about children's personal, social, and emotional development. And so, and not just being tokenistic. So not just having, if you've got a lineup and you've got 5 or 6 speakers, why is it that you've only then put in then one Black person? And I think it's up to then the individuals who are booking onto that conference to look at the lineup and to say, this isn't good enough, because actually, where's the diversity? And it's up to those organisers. And when they say, oh, but it was by recommendation, oh, we need to think about the values of our conference. But what you're saying then, you're not being anti-racist. You're not casting your net out wider, because when I'm, the conference that I've organised a conference and I have organised events before, I can get diverse speakers. You know, they are out there, and bringing in speakers that colleagues haven't heard before. That's important as well, to bring in other individuals, other Black and brown speakers who are not well known, to have their voice shared and have that mixture again in terms of diversity. So you have your academics, your lecturers, you have parents speaking, and you have the educators and teachers, and that's your full diversity. There is an organisation called, I think, the BAME in education. They've produced a guide to help conference organisers when they are producing when they are thinking about a conference, because that's when we can make those changes. When we see people like you and I speaking, we're inspiring other Black and brown educators and teachers to say, well, I can do it. And then also to equally for white colleagues to think, wow, they've got all this lived experience. And we know research informs us that when you have diverse people working together, you improve on the quality and the outcomes. So it's a no-brainer, really, right?
Yeah, I would absolutely say so. I think, you know, it's ultimately about creating space and that empowerment that we've discussed previously. I mean, I'll just share now that when I was an early years practitioner, I think I've told you this story in the past, back when I worked for a large chain nursery, and we had a CPD training day, and you delivered that training. And I'll apologise that I can't remember the content, but I always remember you. And you know, having you there, you know, it's really inspiring to me as a speaker and trainer, and kind of led me on the career that I've been down now. So, you know, that alone really speaks to the value of creating space and Black and minority speakers delivering training to open up those avenues and make educators aware that this could be a path for them.
And I think, Shaddai, I do remember it actually. Yeah. And I remember the location. I actually think it was for a local authority, if memory serves me right, and then your whole team came along. And again, when we're thinking about diversity, why I remembered you, Shaddai, you're black and you're male. Yeah. So very frequently, so again, when I'm speaking at audiences, they could be very few black individuals in the audience. And if they are, you zoom into them because you want to make those connections. And again, we have very few black male educators. We have yourself, we have Josh, we have Jamal doing fantastic work, and we have a few others. But how, again, can we make sure that we bring in that diversity in terms of that entry level, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's also something there about advice for white educators and trainers delivering their training, and the need for them to be ensuring that they're delivering their message in an anti-racist way that reaches the whole audience whenever they're speaking.
Absolutely. And that, I think, comes back down to my point. If you are, you know, a trainer or a consultant, how are you weaving into that anti-racist message? How are you including your colleagues, you know, Shaddai, Josh, Jamal and Liz and many others? And how are you sometimes, one of the things I would say, how are you sometimes stepping down from the table? And a white educator I have to mention is Sue Cowley. Sue, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your surname correctly. So Sue Cowley, who is an educator, writer, she stood down from a table. She stood down and gave me a seat at the table. So when we're talking about anti-racism in practice, it's a doing word. So sometimes as a white educator, as a white trainer, to give that space, you may have to step down to give somebody else room. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about other probably less known educators. And I'm always one for passing on the baton to say, well, okay, then these are other black educators who are speakers. They're doing some fantastic work on working with babies. Bring them in to talk about there's no excuse. That's what I'm trying to say. That's the bottom line for people to say they haven't thought about diversifying their network to make those changes.
Yeah, there absolutely is. There's no excuses there, really. But it is really important in a kind of fundamental way that we have that diverse audience and the diverse.
And that's why I said it's not me. There are other individuals out there. And that's why sometimes I do step down and I say, well, okay, there's Jamal, there's Josh, there's yourself, there's Liz, there's so many others. It's not always about myself. It's about then how I can bring in other people to give them space and to give them a voice, you know?
Absolutely. And Laura, that's a fantastic place to end this episode. So we've covered all aspects of representation, and you've offered some brilliant guidance and support for listeners today. Thank you so much. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Laura, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Laura Henry-Allain MBE. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.